Welcome everybody. I would like to show you some of the results that we've got when we studied vocal behavior in bats. We do focus on echolocation, however, we were trying to find out if bats use echolocation also for a communicative function. So I would like to thank my previous students at UCT that did the bulk of the data collection. They managed to publish most of it, and most of what I'm showing today is really based on their experimental work and field work. So the main question is, do they use echolocation calls also for communication? Most of the vocalizations that we heard about are basically used for communication purposes. However, there are a few species that we already heard about that use vocalizations for a very different purpose, which is for orientation and for foraging. And bats really mastered echolocation for that purpose. So bats have social calls. So these are a few examples of social calls that bats have. So they specifically use different call types in different contexts to communicate with each other. So there are social call types. However, there is the idea that they also use echolocation to communicate, and there are different reasons why this was brought up as an option. One of it is that echolocation is almost constantly emitted by bats. So why not use that signal that's already readily available for communication? But there are more concrete examples why this could be. But I first want to say something about this type of echolocation. So this is a constant frequency call, usually emitted by certain bat species. For example, the horseshoe bat that we also have here in the Kruger National Park. It's a very simply structured call, as you can see in the sonogram above. I would like to show you how it sounds. It's really not very spectacular, you can already tell. It's a very simple structure, so let's see if it plays. I'm going to play it back 10 times slower than it actually is. You can maybe see, or maybe not, but you can get here from the y-axis. It's a very high frequency call, almost 100 kilohertz, so we have no chance of hearing it. So even slowing it down 10 times will still mean it's very high. So let's try if we can hear anything. Sorry, now I'm also struggling. So those were just the last 3 pulses. Very short, a few milliseconds, very high in frequency, not very spectacular, right? So, however, what these bats do with this very simple call is very complex. So you can see here a video showing what bats are doing. These horseshoe bats are perch hunters. That means they stay in the environment, perched somewhere, hanging upside down, as bats do. And then they send out those echolocation calls. They scan their environment, and the moment they perceive the signature of a flying moth, in this example, they will go and localize and capture it. So the point I want to make with this slide is that although it's a very simply structured call, the information that they get out is very detailed and complex. So in this specific group of bats, the acoustic signal that they send out is carried mainly by a constant frequency tone. That's what we heard. When this sound wave hits the moving wings of an insect, something very specific happens. When this insect moves its wings up and down, the sound wave impinges on it and kind of gets pushed or pulled, which means there is a Doppler shift happening. And when that happens, the constant frequency component of that call changes in a specific way and carries peaks or glints. So you can hopefully see that in the lower part here, there are suspicious indicators of the movement of the wings of bats, acoustic glints in frequency and in amplitude. So that gives them a very clear signal that there is a moth flying. So simpler structure, very complex information that they can get out of these echolocation calls. So why do we think this could be used for communication? There are 2 observations that kind of initiated this kind of research on it. The first observation is that we find a very systematic variation in echolocation calls, mainly the frequency between species. that has no obvious explanation like body size or phylogeny or the environment like the climate or prey size. I will talk about that in a second. The second observation that we made that indicated to us it could be used for communication is that some of those echolocation calls look slightly different than others. We called them modified echolocation calls, and we wanted to know why these modifications are added to regular echolocation calls. So the first observation was not our observation, but was done or was found already in the late 80s in the Southeast Asian bat assemblage. You see different species here in the echolocation calls, and what stood out to the researchers there is that each species seems to occupy a specific frequency band. They tested alternative hypotheses like prey size that could influence or drive the selection for specific frequencies. They looked at body size, they looked at phylogenetic signals and the climate. Well, this is a bat community, so they were all in the same area. And they could not find an alternative explanation, so what they thought is these bat species might partition the acoustic space to facilitate interspecific communication. In our southern African horseshoe bat species, we found a similar pattern. So these are some of our species, not all of them. And you might think, well, the pattern is not as clear as in the figure before, because there seems to be some overlap. But the species that show overlap in peak frequencies don't occur sympatrically. So there is no overlap in the assemblages that we find. So that's the first observation. There seems to be a pattern in kind of how species separate the acoustic space. The second observation was these modified echolocation calls. So when we go through the recordings, once in a while we find those calls that have a little bit of an add-on at the beginning or the end of the call. Here you can see one modification at the end of the call. It's like a slight upward sweep, nothing spectacular. But we wanted to know, why does that happen? Is it just a sound production artifact, or does it mean anything? Is that added on purpose or intentionally? So we analyzed calls of a number of individuals. I think it was 16 or 19 individuals, and we wanted to know, can those calls be classified to those individuals if we only use the regular echolocation calls versus modified echolocation calls? And what we found is that the regular echolocation calls were classified to about 40% correctly to that individual, whereas if we use from the same set of individuals the modified echolocation calls, that classification success almost doubled. So we thought we could kind of see if that carries any communicative function. But because we're talking about communication, we cannot just look at the signal and the sender. We have to include the receiver as well to find out if it's meaningful. As we just heard in the previous talk, it's not enough to only look at signatures that are encoded in the signal. It's also important, when we want to know if it's communication, to include the decoding or the perception of those signatures. So we set up a kind of a pipeline of experiments and questions we ask where we include both sides. Then we started off by looking at the signal and taking several acoustic standard measurements from those calls. And we found that there are strong species-specific signatures, as well as sex-specific signatures, and also to some extent individual-specific signatures in those calls. Then we took it to the receiver side, and we did an experiment. It's a habituation-dishabituation experiment. Our first plenary speaker mentioned this kind of experiment. You train a bat, in this case a bat, to listen to a playback, in this case echolocation calls of one species, and then you dishabituate it, or you test if a new playback from a different species, for example, elicit kind of a discriminative response. So it looks like this. You train a bat to listen to this habituation signal, the same species, a playback sequence of echolocation calls, and after a while it will get habituated, And the moment it will get habituated, it means it kind of get used to the sound, doesn't really respond anymore, and at that stage you switch over to your test signal. The control would be the same species, and then the test would be a different species. And you observe if the bat responds, which is what we see in a second. In this case, the bat responds, so we played back the calls of a different species now, and it perceived the difference. So the difference between the two species acoustically was detected by our test subjects, and we tested it on different species with different combinations of playbacks, and they showed that they can differentiate between the acoustic signatures that we first described. Okay, now we wanted to know if they increase the communicative clarity in calls by adding this modified upward sweep to the echolocation calls. So we wanted to kind of put our test subjects in different situations where communication would be needed more or less. So first of all, that modified part is sitting on an FM component, a frequency modulated component. So that component is very, very important for the actual or primary function of echolocation, because it helps the bats to range, to assess distance. That's now utmost important when you hunt for small little insects flying in the sky. So you need to know exactly how far it is. That means if you modify that, it might interfere with that ranging function. So we wanted to know, do they add those modifications if they really rely on ranging or not? So we put bats in an obstacle course where they really need that information to test if they still use those modified calls or not. Then we created different situations for the bat. We let them fly in a flight cage alone, with conspecifics, with heterospecifics, or only with playbacks of conspecifics, and thereby wanted to see if those different situations create more or less modified echolocation calls. And the results are shown here. They are not very clear. The only clear thing is that when they really need ranging function, they suppress modified echolocation calls. So that's the very clear result. Very clear result from this. The other results are not so conclusive, which means even if we enforce a situation where they should benefit from communication, they do not increase the emission of modified echolocation calls. So I would like to summarize how far we got with answering our questions. Do they actually use echolocation to communicate? So the first part is, yes, we found that those signals carry signatures that can be used for communication. We also showed that bats can perceive those signatures. We showed that it doesn't seem that there is an intentional signaling of more complex vocal add-ons to those echolocation calls. So that lets me to conclude that I don't think echolocation is really a communication signal, it's more of an eavesdropping cue. What we have not done yet, because it's difficult to set up an experiment like this, is to understand if they don't only perceive the signatures, but they do something with it. They use it, they extract information, and, for example, base a decision on it. So they can perceive it, but is it meaningful? Does it mean anything for the animals to change their behavior when they perceive those signatures? So, in conclusion, so far from all of our experiments that we did, we would say that can they communicate with echolocation? Probably more not. It's not a communication signal. We would advocate that it is an eavesdropping signal that other bats can kind of gather information from, but not really intentionally emit to communicate. Okay, thank you very much.